Bryant.
Today we are learning basketball with Roshan Potluri. You can find him on Twitter at Pick and Row. He does scouting and analytics work with Los Capitanes, the G League team in Mexico. He covers the NBA draft for Swish Theory, and he is the founder of Pistons Fleet. Super excited to dive into a whole bunch of draft ideas today. We're going to dive into some of his work with Swish Theory on closeout creation, on draft philosophy, and end it with a little draft exercise where we target the best wings in the 2025 NBA draft. So super excited to talk all things hoops here. But before we dive in, how you doing today, Ro?
I'm doing great, man. It's a great Saturday. We have some Elite Eight games going on today, but I appreciate you for having me on.
Absolutely, I'm glad we could finally make this happen. We just love basketball here and love diving into things like that. So, before we actually dig into all the actual hoops, I would love to hear a little bit about your journey, your path into, breaking into basketball and working in basketball. Where did you start? What was your journey like? And, any advice to anyone that would like to get into scouting and analytics and working with the team one day?
Oh, for sure. I mean, I grew up a Pistons fan. I was born in Detroit, so the Pistons have always been kind of part of my identity early on. So I was really into basketball that way, but middle of my life I moved to India, so the Pistons were kind of the only way for me to have a connection back to the States. So was watching a lot of games at 5 a.m. in the morning, middle school and high school. And that really got me into the NBA and basketball in general. And I played just for fun, pick up that sort of thing. But I was really getting into the draft because the Killian Hayes pick I was really enamored with him and was really surprised at the time because I was really new to the whole thing and really understanding scouting. So he was one guy that made me really want to dig deeper into basketball and just scouting in general. From there, my first year of college, I actually tore my ACL playing hoops.
Oh, no.
So that also, it was a good experience looking back on it, just because that's kind of what got me into looking into analytics, biomechanics, learning how players' bodies work. But those two events in my life kind of started scouting for me and just really being interested in basketball that way. But yeah, I think, starting off, I was just really putting my thoughts out on my Twitter account and, writing here and there before I started writing for Swish. And I think the best advice I give to someone that's, starting out with hoops is kind of try to understand what's happening with the game from a scheme perspective and just what's actually happening on the court, even from a numbers perspective, trying to contextualize what's happening on the court. And just try to get better at it every day. 1% better, but you try to figure out. I'm not great at scouting. Not me personally, but if you're a person starting out, you might be saying, okay, I'm not great at scouting someone's shot, or I'm not great at understanding what the defense is trying to do. Kind of building on those foundational blocks for scouting, I think, is really important. Just being able, because it'll apply to any prospect that you talk about, and I think that's really important.
Yeah, I mean, first off, real glass half full kind of perspective when you tear your ACL playing basketball, but you spun it the right way. You got to learn from it, and really, it sounds like you couldn't really go anywhere else, so you're diving into the stats.
Yeah, I had a lot of time on my hands.
A lot of time to focus, no doubt, and that's a great perspective to kind of notice your own weaknesses in the scouting perspective, because everyone has their own eye test. Everyone that's something that I like about scouting and have definitely learned, is that essentially everyone has a different opinion on everything, and that people are prioritizing different skills, they're looking for different skills, they see different things, they read different things, they all view almost every prospect slightly differently based on the film they've caught, the games they saw, the numbers they see. But as we've said probably on the podcast before, when it comes to the analytics, you can't see everything. You can't watch every game. So the analytics are a great tool to kind of show you what happened over the course of a season or a long sample size like that. And then you watch the film and dig into it for the eye test to show you a little about how and why it happened. And the more you learn and understand the game, the better you can kind of correlate the two and explain, everything between a player's talent to their role and opportunity. Is he a good 3-point shooter because he hit a lot of open shots? Is it because he's pulling up and creating those looks himself? Is it because the scheme of the system and the team just creates a lot of open looks? So anyone that's, an average shooter might become an above average shooter, and all these different factors. So it's a super interesting dynamic there between just trying to combine scouting and analytics, and I think they go hand in hand, and they're just more tools, more info to take in as much info as possible as you can to really just improve your evaluation process. So I know we can't talk too much about Los Capitanes, but what's it been like working with them, with an actual G League NBA or team here, where this is a legit team. I mean, I want to say there's what's interesting that not everyone might not realize is they are not affiliated with an NBA team. So they're, I think, the only one where they're just such a great basketball center in the Latin community, where a lot of players in that area are targeted to play for them eventually. And so they're just competing for you are just competing for G League success and winning. And there is no developmental factor for another NBA team where you're just taking in, half the roster for one game and then they all ship back over to the bench on the NBA side. So what's that been like, the whole experience?
I mean, it's been a great experience. I mean, it's been really fun. Like, and I think you pointed out to how it's very different in terms of a G League team. Every other team has an affiliate, so kind of there's different obstacles and there's different requirements that come with the team. I'd say that one thing that's been really interesting to do is, for the longest time I was scouting from the public sphere, which is, especially with draft scouting, you're kind of scouting from a vacuum. You don't know your team context. You don't know where a player is going to end up. And that's, working with those set of variables with a team has been a really great experience of how to adapt to those different scenarios and what might come through in different parts of the season. Outside of that, I'd say that the Cap 10 is we're specifically. I wouldn't say we're not looking at development like other teams. We definitely are. It's just there is more of emphasis on winning, like you pointed out.
As we said before, a lot of our work online is almost in theory, and it's putting our thoughts to paper. And this is how you might do the evaluation if you were with a team full time. And now there's the difference between writing your thoughts in theory and actually executing them and practicing them and
Right.
being a part of the team. So I was curious what that communication and evaluation process is like. But obviously you're only allowed to speak so much on that.
Yeah, I mean it's definitely good professional experience in terms of understanding how things work in the background for a team. Working with front office and working with coaching staff and kind of understanding what the different needs are between those two different parts of an organization. That's been very eye opening for me. But it's been a great experience going through it for the first time this season and just experiencing how. How teams adapt throughout a season, especially for a team like the Capitanes, who are focused on, winning games more than so another G League team.
Yeah, very cool. And shout out to the whole team. I know we got a few friends on Twitter that have joined the staff. If you want to give any of them a shout, one of the first episodes we did on the Learning Basketball podcast with Antonio Diaz. That was really interesting to dive into some of his favorite international prospects and hear his perspective. So, shout out to the whole team. They clearly see the talent putting out good evaluations and just trying to, bring them all together.
Yeah, we have a great team. I mean, Antonio, Ignacio, they're all hard workers and really smart. So, having that support system within a team, especially as my first experience, it's been awesome. Yeah.
There it is. So I would love to dive into some of your pieces with Swish Theory. I thought we could start with um, an article titled Closeout Creation, the Fulcrum of NBA Offenses. And I'll pull it up here while we're talking for those watching on video here. But, from what I gather, it really hits on advantage creation and, the idea of that's almost what basketball boils down to in a sense is just the ability to
hmm
create a slight advantage or a mismatch that you can take advantage of for one possession to get a good look, a good shot, where whatever the team's goal is to do that. So what led to this idea and execution of this article? Was it watching any certain players like Jace Richardson that you mentioned in here, or just kind of Jace being a good example of kind of what you're getting at, and what all do you dive into that people should come in and read it?
Oh, definitely. I mean, so a lot of my draft work. I mean, we're scouting for the NBA, so a lot of it is derivative of what's happening in the league. So I was watching most of these great teams in the playoffs, and a lot of these teams like the Celtics and the Thunder, a lot of them are operating off of the idea of create an advantage, kick the ball out, create another advantage off of another drive. That whole driving kick process that consistently happens, and I feel like teams are now really gearing towards that style of play where they have 6 to 8 people that can do all three of those things: dribble, pass, and shoot, and consistently create even minor advantages on a possession-to-possession basis. So that's really what brought around this piece. And then when I was, really scouting this draft class, I saw that there were a lot of players that kind of fit how the different ways of creating off of a closeout would happen. Um, and for example, Jace is a guy that he's beating you more with how he works with sharp driving angles, and he has good burst, but it's not say someone like Jaden Ivey, in 2022, who's just it's 1 percentile, 99 percentile NBA burst, right? But he's still beating guys off the dribble with his speed and with some of the way he can coordinate in tight spaces. So Jace is an example of that. I really wanted to talk about guys that can kind of create off the catch in with change of direction, shifting guys east west off of with their handle or just their general hip mobility. So a guy like Xavier Lee was out of Princeton is a guy that really is fantastic at not just moving east west, but also like accelerating and decelerating and just really shifting defenders off that way. And then I talked about a lot of other ways that you could create off the catch, because right now in the league it's not that you have your star creators and or your secondary creators or tertiary creators. It's almost everybody on the court now has to be offensively talented and gifted enough to be able to create in that single drive, whether that's just attacking a straight line drive or making a pass out of that, or making a mid-range shot out of it. There's counters to everything now, and players just have to be really advanced offensively at this point. At least with the teams that are really vying for those high-level playoff spots and are contenders. It's almost become a thing where you have to have 4 to 5 guys that can do that on the court at the same time. So another way that I was looking at, how players create off of closeouts, another guy that does it in a different way is strength, and that's Noah Penda. He's really great at, he uses a lot of momentum to use his body to kind of get downhill and move guys out of his way, and then he's a fantastic processor. So he can usually find the open advantage very quickly and passing deliveries are all great. And he's a strong defender, so that kind of also gives him kind of a margin of error to play on the offensive end, because the shot is still kind of a work in progress, because he's good at shooting off of 2 feet, from a catch and shoot perspective, but, start to put in any like momentum or movement into the shot, he starts to struggle. Or, most of his 3-point shooting percentages are lower because of the off the dribble shooting, or even shooting off of movement, but he's actually pretty solid on catch and shoot. So that's another way. And again, so talking about shooting, it's like that's another way for players to kind of leverage these traits, right? Their strength, their change of direction, their burst. Is that shooting gravity is going to form some sort of hard closeout, and that's going to cause players to kind of have more of an opportunity to attack inside the arc. So yeah, Penda's great. He's a different way of using strength. So he's not, putting you on the hip from the start of the drive and kind of pushing you down until he gets to the rim. He's kind of using his strength to kind of, with momentum, and kind of building that torque up, and then, really kind of using his strength as kind of like a counter and problem solving. When he's at the rim. Another guy that, LeBaron is another guy that's like really great with his handle and just really great at tight spaces. He's got great touch inside the arc. Very, very awesome floater. It's very automatic. But reminds me of Nick Smith in that sense, from Arkansas a couple years ago. But he's a better defender, and his shot is still much more work in progress. He's for a guard, it's probably the volume is on the lower end, and but what he does when he does get that closeout, when he's able to kind of attack a collapse defense and kind of maneuver in those tight spaces, he's really effective at doing that. And then just using his touch to kind of play finish in those situations. So he's another guy that should be really interesting how his development goes, because of the defense, there might be some ways he can kind of scale more as like a guy, especially as he gains more weight, because he does have more of a sinewy frame right now. But once he kind of gains that strength, is he someone that can maybe guard a little higher up in position too? And I didn't really talk about defense in this piece, but it's something that kind of allows a player who might not be a real creator in a sense, but can kind of do these simpler decisions off the catch. It kind of gives them that, margin of error to kind of work on offense and kind of develop some of the more creation skills. Yeah, Flagg's the perfect example of a guy that just is functionally very strong. He's high school senior age. He's not even supposed to be here right now and playing college basketball and dominating it, but he is, and he's just like the perfect example of a guy that can kind of put, get lower than his defender's center of gravity. Kind of uses shoulders, wider shoulders, to kind of create separation and create a lever effect, and really, get his way all the way to the rim. So this is another way of strength creation that this is more what I was talking that Penda doesn't really do. So it's like, the way I would kind of describe it is like the initiation of the drive, Flagg is really using his strength, functional strength in that way, whereas Penda's using his strength more as a problem-solving tool for play finishing. So, though, that's kind of the difference there, but you see a lot of different players in the league that kind of do different ways of doing this. Like, I think Paolo is a specific example. Both Paolo and Franz kind of fit both this too, is where they both kind of create these drives off of using their shoulders and kind of Paolo specifically gets into this lever effect and kind of leverages his strength all the way to the rim or into a mid-range shot. And Franz is more of a guy that can kind of, he uses his strength more as like a play finishing thing, where it's like, you get him into pick and roll, gets his defender in jail, and then he's kind of using his strength to kind of maneuver the defender in the way he wants to. And that's kind of the difference there, I think. But you see it like even your star creators in the league kind of have to have the skill of being able to just when teams play more aggressive defensive coverages, you have to be able to do something off the ball. When the team when the defense kind of forces the star player to kind of give up the ball, and you have to kind of go into your other actions in your organized offense.
Yeah, there's a lot of great points to hit on there. I think at its core, like totally agree with with the whole theme of this piece that especially here at the end here that kind of summarizes it. But just the idea that having as few weaknesses as possible is how you don't get exploited, especially down the
Right.
line and farther in the playoffs. And people instantly will think of how many shooters do you have on the floor, or how many non-defenders do you have on the floor. And I think the most a team can get away with like a hole like that is maybe one position if there's enough to cover it up elsewhere. Like if like take the Warriors, you think of them as 5 out, but really it's the whoever coined it, the 4.5 out, where Draymond is operating at the top of the key and being a handoff hub and a playmaking hub there, where he can't. I mean, he can take a three, but he's not necessarily. He's not one of the Splash Brothers for a reason.
Right.
Like he's not threat.
Right.
The defense wants that to happen essentially. So, I think having as few holes as possible is how you don't get picked on. So being able to dribble, pass, and shoot around, especially around your star players, is just key to any functional offense. And especially being able to process quickly as you get at, like with Penda as an example. And random, but I'm glad you mentioned Nick Richards and the floater. Like that is the one thing that sticks out for me from scouting him as well, is just that touch. So that really is a nice kind of promising sign for Phylon and his offensive game and shooting development as well, because those touch indicators are huge. And I'm big fan of Phylon. He just makes winning plays out there, and you noted the defense is a big part of that. And he's just a smart player that hustles hard and plays hard. I've seen him mocked like as high as the lottery, and as low as the 20s and stuff. So I mean, there's a pretty wide range, it feels like, in this draft where these guys could go. But I totally agree that being a plus defender allows a little wiggle room to develop the offensive skills. Like you have a much better chance of being a starter in this league if you can hold your own defensively, and if you can simply make good decisions with the ball and offer a role offensively. It doesn't have to be everything. You just have to contribute to the lineup, the balance of the floor in some way that makes sense for the team, where that really works out. So I think that that's how the defense is like the baseline to be a starter in this league, unless you're basically a star offensive player. So that's a good note on him, and big fan of what Phylon's doing. Obviously, Flagg is incredible. The first name I thought of is someone who used to play with Cooper Flagg when I first looked through this article, and that's Liam McNeely down at Mount Verde. And you could also say Con Knipple now at Duke is in a similar role off of Flagg, where to me, a lot of the looks that Liam would get at Mount Verde were attacking closeouts created by Flagg's drive and kick. And it was normally a fairly basic like crossover drive into the paint. He sucked in one defender, he kicks out, and it's like a dream for Liam, where he's open for three, and if someone's rushing out to contest, he pumps and drives and throws down a hammer dunk. And that almost like you might imagine like Malik Monk doing off of all in Sacramento as well. Just that ability to threaten the 3-point shot, but also be able to dribble, drive, attack the rim off of it, either score, draw a foul, or keep the ball moving with another kick out, and just this endless drive and kick relocation type of style of play that really works for most teams in the modern game, I think. And good note as well on Franz and Paulo. They definitely use their strength that way. That Franz is super shifty, super smart, where he just uses very patient driver, and he'll. I have a piece coming out today actually on those two, and just getting at their creation ability as well. So check that out on Swish Theory. I guess this is going to be in the future, so 5 days ago, but you can find it eventually there. So, another great piece that you put up here with Swish Theory is your 2025 NBA draft board, and also some draft philosophy notes. So I would love to dive into the draft philosophy side of things, as we're also going to do a little bit of a big board exercise with the wings after. So generally speaking, what do you look for when you're scouting potential NBA players? And obviously, every player is different. They all have different skills. They can maybe fill different roles. But is there any traits or skills or mindsets, energy, something that you notice with thinking the game, the feel for the game? Is there any one or two kind of attributes that you're looking for to say, like, that I think this will translate to the pros?
Yeah, I think there's not a specific framework saying that, hey, there's these three traits that I want from a player. This is what is necessary for them to succeed. I think it differs player to player and how they operate, what their role could look like in the league. I think that's what a lot of archetype bias comes from, and just looking at, okay, does this guy do this in a specific way, and does that fit an NBA role in a cookie cutter mold? But for me specifically, I really derive a lot of prospect value from margin of error. And this is more to do with how a player applies their tools or their traits, essentially, and how that leads to production. With my original philosophy was more in line with advantage creation, kind of trying to see, okay, does a guy consistently create advantages, even if it's minor? How does that improve their margin of error when they're playing on the court? And that's it's a good philosophy, but it had its flaws in the sense that not every positive player is going to be creating advantages. They still might need some help through their the other players that are on the court, because it's 5-on-5 at the end of the day. You're still going to be valuing players that might need a screen to kind of create out of PNR, or so for me, like the biggest shift in philosophy there was kind of seeing another Swish piece, Avinash's ED piece last year for the 2024 cycle, and it was just a really eye-opening reading in terms of, okay, there's other ways that you can create value and improve your margin of error. For example, with Edie, such a monster rebounder, offensive rebounder, that he's in a sense creating possessions in that way and really creating advantages, quote unquote. And so I just kind of moved my philosophy instead to kind of value margin of error based off of how effectively a player can apply those tools that they have, whether that's feel, whether that's, their, anthropometric measurements like your wingspan and your general burst and all those sort of things, or is it just something that's positional? Is it something that the biggest thing I look at here in the piece specifically is, age is a huge thing. You kind of showing that a player can kind of do these, apply their traits and be productive, especially with really strong competition. Even though they're playing against high major teams, there's still such a gap between college teams or even your international teams between that and the NBA. So it's, for a lot of these young guys, they're still developing. So just showing that you at that level you can kind of produce at a young age kind of shows that mastery of skills, even if it's a very small role. And then the other thing I really value is, because today's league is so, every player is so versatile and teams really value versatility. I had a Furphy piece last year that kind of talked about role malleability, and that was where I really started valuing guys that could really just be a jack of all trades, but when you're a jack of all trades, kind of having a mastery in those skills and being really productive in that. So a lot of that is like applying how you're processing your feel, just having great motor, just your some guys might be able to jump high, but they might not be actually functionally doing that on the court. And that's what I really mean by when I say application of tools is kind of, are they really functionally doing that on the court? And that really, I think, is important. And then more of like the role stuff that I'm talking about, like skill intersections. Like I talk about this with Furphy to an extent, is he's kind of got this skill intersection of the skills he's good at are positively aligned in terms of a basketball context. So what I mean by that is like Furphy's a great offensive rebounder and an elite transition player. So those two skills kind of, because of the flow of the game, kind of overlap with each other, and they form this really great intersection of value for a player. And that I think really helps with your margin of error on the court, because you're consistently creating value in that possession. So for example, Furphy's great at offensive rebounding. He's got this background in Australian football, and he can kind of attack everything in the open court. So that was something, for example, where I'd say is a positive intersection. But for example, a negative intersection would be like, say a player has not that great of a handle, but can shoot and kind of do a little bit of everything, passing and everything. But again, with the closeout creation piece, it's not just that you can shoot, it's that you can actually leverage other skills once that shooting gravity is given to you. And that's kind of where that negative intersection comes, is if you can't really attack off the dribble, then you're kind of slowing down the possession. And that's actually something I didn't really touch on in the last piece is, defender, you have great defenders, but that a great defender doesn't necessarily mean they're good at guarding all types of matchups, right? Some guys are better with dealing with stronger players. Some guys are better with dealing with bursty players. But the idea of the closeout creation piece was that if you have different guys that can do it in a different way, and you have 5 guys on the court that can all attack closeouts in a different way, you would have such a varied offense that it's difficult for defenses to keep up with that. Like, you really have to vary your defensive personnel to kind of deal with that. And today's NBA is kind of like this war of attrition between offenses and defenses. Offenses are consistently trying to extend possessions with offensive rebounds and like the driving kicks that I'm talking about, where if your first action or your secondary action doesn't work, you have other options on the offense that can kind of create something for you. And from a defensive perspective, you're trying to end possessions all the time. It's either that or you're trying to slow down the offense to a point where they don't create anything great out of that offensive possession. So that's kind of what I'm looking at in terms of when I'm really trying to see a player's value, is how do they kind of operate with their role in the league. I try to stay away from archetype bias because a player might play a specific role in college, but that could drastically change in the league because they might have had skills that they didn't show in that college role. Maybe they showed it off in grassroots. So that's another reason why I also scout grassroots and kind of get an understanding of their full game from that perspective and see what they could really apply their tools to. And, with the margin of error thing, I've kind of looked at it, especially how I rank my board now is through this. So I'm looking at, okay, if this player goes to a positive development context, what does that look like? What does it look like if they're going to a medium? It's a good roster construction for them, but maybe it's not the best place for them to develop those skills, or even where both of those things aren't great for that player in that situation. So I kind of try to look at what those different development contexts could look like for a player and kind of rank my board off of that. I mean, it's really difficult to really, from a vacuum, scout and say, this is a player's outcome, this is what he's going to hit, without knowing that context. So that draft philosophy piece was more of how it can make sense to even do that ranking or the boards from a public sphere, because so much of it is player context and development, especially since all these guys are so young. So that's kind of the gist of the piece. But yeah,
Yeah, a lot of super interesting things there, and like right off the top, like I think prioritize or being aware of, like you said, the idea that everyone isn't going to create advantages on the court. Like you need someone to create them and someone to finish them. So, the play
right,
finisher element almost becomes underrated because everyone in terms of the draft probably wants to find their offensive engine, or a scoring creator, as I dub it in a piece that I've done a while back, where someone who is the primary decision maker, they can score, they can create for others, and they have the good decision making feel to read the defense, react, and choose the best play possible consistently almost every play, almost every night. And we have gone a little bit away from heliocentric basketball that way, but we still have Jokic around. We still have Trae Young and a Luka and these type of stars that do those things. So I think what's important is there's only so many of those guys. So it's one thing to aesthetically look like one of those guys, but if you're not actually going to carry a franchise with that talent, the talent and production might not be good enough to let that player create that many offensive possessions themselves. So I also think when it comes to the draft, as I've said before on the pod, there's almost like a line in every draft where, okay, I think these 3, 5, 7 players could be that type of star creator if everything works right. And I also like how you put it there at the end, trying to envision the best case scenario in terms of a situation and role, the worst case scenario, and how scalable that player's skills are between the two. The first name that popped to mind in that idea is a Derek Queen, where, he, in the best case scenario, maybe a team that doesn't have too much going on brings him in and really unleashes him as a downhill handoff playmaking hub to run the offense through him and maximize his feel for the game and maybe surround him with some play finishers and shooters, versus maybe the worst case scenario for him is going to a team that already has their creators in place and they're looking for like a D&3 type wing or something. It's just not his game. So it wouldn't be scalable in that sense of, a smaller role well, maybe we don't know, of course, until he gets there, but that it's projection. So, will that scalability work in a smaller role where he doesn't have the ball in his hands and now he's just off the ball, play finishing all the time? It depends. Is the player going to accept that role mentally if they think they're a star, or if they've been projected a star their whole life? Where the last couple of drafts, maybe Jabari Smith or now Ace Bailey in this one, are viewed as these potential stars who definitely look like stars with their shot making and their defense and their shooting. And those skills I also think are scalable down a little bit. But if something doesn't work out with their role and situation and opportunity and development, those key words that matter for every player's success, I believe talent is one part of the equation, but it's as much to do with where you end up and who you're playing with in terms of your long-term success and development in the league. So these are guys where, maybe a team drafts them to be stars, but at the same time, they might be most effective with a lower usage as play finishers rather than being asked to create every look for themselves and others. So it's an interesting kind of balance and scalability there as well.
no, I definitely agree. It's. I mean, you're looking at. I mean, the bar to be a primary creator in the league is so high. Like even someone say Trae Young, you see kind of some of the flaws that having a small guard. Defensively, what that does for you have to kind of build in a certain way to accommodate for that type of player. So it's and then we talk about a lot of these players at the top that are fit the part of an advantage creator, look the part, but they might be really flawed in certain aspects, and reaching that margin to be a primary creator, it's just too much for that player to maybe overcome. So you kind of have to look at, does that, like you said, like, does that player have any tools or skills that can kind of scale them down in a different role if that doesn't work out? And a lot of the time it doesn't, because every draft class you have maybe 20 to 25 guys that are actually NBA players from each draft class. So it's really important to kind of see how that player might operate in different roles in different contexts.
Yeah, the odds are definitely against you when it comes to the draft or getting it right, and that's why some like that. I would say people that call the draft like a crapshoot or something or totally random. Like it's one of those things where I imagine they don't really have enough information on all these players, because someone that really dives into the film and the stats and could tell you everything you need to know about 50 players in the draft. I would say they're a little more aware of strengths and weaknesses and these scalable roles and where team fits would be best. But there's also so much randomness and luck involved between all these other factors that they're not totally wrong after a certain point. Like, so
Yeah.
it's kind of funny how that balance works out. So I thought we could end the pod here diving into a little bit of a NBA draft, but only for wings. Anyone who we think, and we're going to use a broad definition of wings here. Anyone who can guard twos, threes, or even fours. You know, maybe some of them can guard ones as well. Maybe some of them can guard fives as well. But, you know, just anyone who we think can kind of hold their own guarding wings and then maybe even playing offensively a little bit on the wing at times as well. So I'll let you go first, and we can take turns here just drafting our, you know, favorite wings of the draft. And, you know, I figured let's try to hit on a couple strengths and weaknesses for each of these prospects, and just move right along through it and see how many we can get through. So with the first pick in the wings only 2025 NBA draft, Roshan is on the clock.
Well, I gotta take the most obvious name, Flagg, at the top, but
Oh wow.
I mean, it's insane surprise, but you know, Flagg is the quintessential dribble, pass, shoot wing. I mean, that's he's shown a lot more in terms of creation, especially throughout the season, and especially as we gotten into conference play. But he's fantastic at those three elements. You know, being able to use his functional strength to kind of drive, being able to the shooting development. I mean, to an extent, you could say the earlier part of the season where he wasn't shooting well could just be, you know, a bad sample, because he does have pretty stellar shooting stats from high school. But you know, I think he's kind of gotten better, kind of shooting off the dribble and off the catch too, as the season has kind of progressed. He has some. I want to say, you know, he's very versatile as a defensive wing. You know, can protect the rim, can, you know, guard at the point of attack at 6'10", and be able to also, you know, be an effective help defender. I think all those three things, he's really role malleable on the defensive end. So he's my number one prospect in general, but he's also the number one wing for me because of that. I do think this is more towards his creation stuff. I wouldn't really say this is an issue in terms of just being a dribble pass shoot guy in the league. For someone who's going to be creating more, he is a little jump shot reliant. I think, you know, and that's going to come with age and, you know, some strength development, that he's going to be able to kind of, you know, get further deeper into the rim, not maybe depend on that mid-range turnaround jumper that he has, or just using spin moves in general to kind of create space. The handle and just general how he kind of, you know, the hierarchy of his scoring. You know, do I leverage my shooting to drive, or do I, you know, drive to leverage my shooting? And I think that he's going to slowly start to grow with, and because, you know, Flagg, it's tough to find weaknesses with Flagg. I mean, you know, a guy that young and he's doing what he's doing, it's incredible.
Right. If anything, it's nitpicking among a bar of superstars. So like that's where we're at. Like when it comes to criticizing him, I mean he's one of the most complete prospects I've ever seen play, especially since starting doing all this draft scouting work. And I would say I've just been almost blown away by his offensive progress at Duke. I caught him at Mount Verde many times, and to me, his strengths were the defensive versatility that you mentioned, his ability to just force turnovers, wreak havoc with active hands and activity on that end. But what really stood out on the offensive end to me was his off-ball movement, his smart off-ball feel for the game. That's what I like, running around a screen for a shot or hitting, finding a mismatch at the end of a set and hitting tough shots out of the post, or a midi pull up, like a couple signature shots for him. Like I viewed him as, the ultimate play finisher. But at Duke, he's almost flipped everything. Like, he's gotten the
Right.
opportunity to run the offense, to initiate. He's shooting better, as you mentioned, as the game goes on, and he's just showing he can, at the very least, run pick and rolls to create good looks for himself and others. So I'm definitely interested to see, as we say, scalability, where he ends up and what kind of role he's asked to do. And honestly, I just want to see him unleash now at this point, because I have some concerns too with, say, the handle, the self creation against ISOs, and his ability to create for others. I'd say back in high school, I was still more impressed with Cam Boozer as the offensive engine scoring creator types that we talked about before. But that can change, and Flagg has really shown how impressive he's been as an offensive engine with this incredible Duke team. So shout out Flagg. We all know he's just an incredible prospect this year, and so I'll shift over to his to the number 2 pick, and for me, I'm going with his former high school teammate Asa Newell. Like, the defensive versatility, watching those two, I went to go see Flagg play defense and was also blown away by Ace's defense in the same context. And I imagine those two, with Derek Queen behind them, there's a little, they're all kind of helping each other. It's like a three-headed monster you're up against trying to score. So it probably helps both of them be more active off ball and forcing turnovers that way, especially at the high school level. But even in college, like, he's one of the best shot blockers, help side shot blockers. I'd say his unique skill is his high point on the ball, his combination of that second jump, the verticality, but also his height and reach. It's the reason he's one of the best offensive rebounders in the entire college level, let alone in the draft class. And I think there's enough there on all this closeout creation kind of talk, where I think he is one, to me, an incredible athlete, but kind of a versatile play finisher, where I think he can, I think he's more of a 4 defensively, but plays more like a play finishing 5 offensively. I've compared it to maybe an Aaron Gordon type role next to Jokic, in terms of like the ideal situation for him, where he's not asked to create everything, but he's shown enough to flash a pick and pop 3-point jump shot and pump fake, drive into the paint with really nice footwork and a go-to post move that is just money for him down there. He can develop as a passer and make better reads when he's in pressure, but his activity is just really impressive to me. So I'll go with him for number 2. And if you have any thoughts on him, feel free to add it, and could dive right into the number 3 pick as well.
No, I like that pick a lot because, funny enough, like, Asa was definitely a guy in at Montverde that probably had a lot of his stocks, like his blocks and steals, suppressed playing with Cooper Flagg. I definitely was a little lower on him coming into the season because of that. Just wasn't sure how, whether he was kind of a tweener, whether would he really be able to play the 5. And I think I've kind of had that question answered throughout the season. I think he does have a lot of big skills, in the sense that you can put him in the dunker, you can use him as a role threat. There's a lot of things that way that you can use him, but I think he's going to be optimized in the way that you said, like as an Aaron Gordon 4. Another guy I was thinking for Asa that kind of in play style could make sense is someone like John Collins. Who can kind of play finish really in different ways, whether that's kind of shooting off the catch or kind of, just being put in the dunker spot and just finishing plays from there. I'm more in the lines that I don't think Asa is going to be able to play your true 5 defensively, just because of the rim protection, but at least for a big 5. But I think I think he's a guy that's really intriguing because he's such a good athlete that, I do have some concerns with his handle. But like he can attack in a straight line, but add other variables on the court, and I think that problem solving becomes a little bit more difficult for him. Uh, but he kind of has the athleticism and some of the shooting indicators that he has. It feels like a pretty strong bet to be kind of that player that can kind of defend multiple positions, kind of have that switchability, kind of do some help side rim protection, and then also kind of, offensively do a lot of different play finishing things. And I do think he's not, he's not bad field per se. Let's say like his assist percentage is pretty low, but he's not that number is kind of, I think he's a little bit more high field than that.
Yeah, the high floor. I think he has one of the highest floors in the draft because of everything you just said. Like like no matter in almost the reverse of the Derek Queen example a little bit earlier is that I think his game is a lot more scalable no matter where he ends up, and as long as a team doesn't ask him to create the entire offense, like he can step right into any team, hold his own defensively, play help defense, switch defensively, guard multiple positions, and do all of the play finishing, closeout attacking things that we've been talking about here, where he just fits right in next to a Trae Young or a Jokic or a Luka really well in that sense of complementing each other, making each other better, and maximizing each other's games.
No, definitely. And that kind of leads into my pick, the third pick. But what really sold me on Asa kind of playing more of as a forward, not as a big, because I was a little lower on him because I thought he was kind of a big when the season started. But kind of this game against South Carolina really gave me an idea of how he would play against defenders that are stronger, kind of can get underneath his handle, and kind of, he really showcased that left hook that he has. And if he got it off pretty effectively, but the defender he was playing against, Collin Murray-Boyles, that's my guy since the start of the cycle. I've kind of loved what I've been seeing from him since his grassroots days, and what he even showed even last year as a freshman. He's a guy that I know a lot of people see as like a 5 and I've even comped him to some 5s in the past, like Draymond, but he's really shown a lot throughout the season. I think the context was a really difficult context to be in, offensively at least, and he was pretty much the primary creator for them in that sense, where teams knew he was the biggest threat offensively on the court. So you would see a lot of his touches from the post get immediately doubled, and he really struggled with turnovers to start the season, but you saw a lot of progression with him early on, kind of improving on those turnover issues, being able to, he had, I think, a .9 ATO assist to turnover, but a lot of that is team context dependent because a lot of his play finishers weren't actually finishing his assists, even though the passing volume was quite high. He's a guy that I think can defend a lot. Like he can defend, I would say, effectively 2-5. What he could guard some ones too, but it's I wouldn't say he's optimized. Guarding someone like John on the floor, like you'd want someone who's a little bit more can keep up with Josh, for example, but. He's a guy that's really versatile defensively, and he's like the epitome of a guy that plays with feel on both ends. I think defensively he really understands how rotations are happening and how to be a really effective help defender. And he's different from a lot of the roaming type of prospects that we see, like Jarris Walker, for example. Where he's not just helping to help because that's going to lead to a steal or block. He's helping because he sees that, okay, this rotation is coming over from the weak side. I'm going to go quickly and help so that turns into a turnover. It isn't, okay, there's space there, I'm going to cut in and, get the ball. So there's a lot of feel in that sense. But then also on the offensive end, he's an extremely strong passer. The shooting is probably the biggest concern with him, and that's kind of why I think a lot of people see him more as a big, But like I said, like the progression throughout the season with the turnovers actually came because there was a slight role change for him. He wasn't really being put in the post as often anymore. Instead, they were kind of giving him the ball at the key or uh, the elbows and kind of letting him kind of use his face-up game, which he actually showed a lot of that in high school. Um, so kind of doing that kind of limited the turnovers just because it was giving him the ball in space, kind of let him get downhill, and then kind of use his brute strength to kind of just create stuff at the rim. So I think with him, the shooting is probably the biggest thing from like really scaling down all the way down to as a wing. But defensively, can do all of those things, and the playmaking I think is gonna operate, and the feel is gonna be leveraged in whatever position he's playing, whether that's at the 4 or the 5, or even if the handle improves, he plays at the 3 eventually.
Right, and I know you've been high on him for forever, like second on your big board, over Dylan Harper
Yeah.
for a while now, and it's for good reason. I mean, you just pointed out, the feel is the big one, especially the defensive feel. That play where he just kind of it lives rent free in my mind. He just like sticks his hand in there and pulls the
Yeah, I
ball
know.
right out like he's like Kawhi Leonard or has like a magnet in his hand, like he just palms it, ripping it away, like it that those like instincts, the ability like to actually grab the ball without fouling in that situation, just incredible like hands there. Really impressed by that face up game, that downhill driving ability to just keep attacking that way and get to the rim, and as you mentioned, the defensive versatility is just all around impressive there. So there's a lot to like. I have him right after Asa on my big board at the moment as well, and there's for good reason that especially in a draft that seems very deep with talent but sort of wide open in terms of the actual order. Like
Hmm.
if you love that defensive IQ, that cerebral mind, like you think he's a defensive anchor and something of a playmaking handoff hub, and he can threaten the downhill scoring, maybe draw fouls or kicks that way, like you can envision how he kind of fits into an offense, especially with that defensive versatility where you're not worried about him, being positionless in a bad way. It's like it was 10 years ago. Now it's a good thing
Right.
when you can actually pick up all these positions. So, good shout there. I I don't really view Derek Queen as a wing, so but like I guess he kind of like could also be a 4 in the sense of some of this. So I'll give him a shout out real quick. But with the next pick, I'm gonna go with Ace Bailey. I think he's, obviously mocked really high, top 5 on a lot of these mock drafts. I'm slightly lower on him. I have him about 10. But, in terms of what he brings, we mentioned it before, like the defense can be really impressive in terms of making plays. Like the athleticism is there. He's explosive, force turnovers, starting fast breaks off those turnovers for big swings. He's had some really bright moments throughout the season, even if he's been a little bit down overall compared to expectations. But that the tough shot making, the mobility of that shot making is really impressive. Like being able to get off tough shots from like fadeaways, pulling up almost anywhere on the court, doing it without many dribbles. Those are all impressive traits. And he can knock down the 3 ball as well. So I think there's like a very clear to me like D&3 frame there with a little bit of tough shot making and athleticism juice where the potential lies. So he's definitely an exciting prospect to watch. And I think we're all curious to see some of the maybe the weaknesses of his game, how he develops some of the handles, some of the will he eventually start looking to pass at one point down the line instead of looking for his own shot, because obviously he can get it anytime, so that's his goal. So that would be my next pick at this slot.
I like that pick a lot. He would have been my next pick had you sniped me, but he's a guy that I know a lot of. You see the Kevin Durant comparisons, and he's a guy that a lot of people see as that creator type. I don't personally see that. I think he's going to be a very dynamic play finisher, someone who could shoot off movement, kind of similar to what Asa does, but maybe a lot more with the shooting gravity in terms of how he can kind of shoot off different footwork, shoot off different types of shot types. He's a guy that I think the defense is actually quite underrated. I think with him, he's a guy that's really versatile on that end, because there were a lot of possessions I've seen with Rutgers where, they'd use him as their low man. He's playing the cat and mouse game out of PNR and kind of guarding both the ball handler and big, and doing a really effective job at that. So I think I wouldn't play him at the 5, but there's some versatility there. And I think, going back to Collin Murray-Boyles, he's another guy that, he can play the 5, but I wouldn't necessarily put him there. I wouldn't say that that's what he has to do every possession. I just think both of these guys are kind of, you want someone who can do those things, because a lot of the time offenses are set up in a way to kind of bring the big out to the perimeter with ball screens. And with delays, very specific way of doing that. And, you need to have other guys that can kind of protect the rim on the back line. So Ace is a great shout. But if I would have taken Ace, had you sniped my guy that I'm saying right now with the fifth pick? Are we in the 5th pick?
Yeah, with number 5.
Or
Roshan is on the clock.
Okay. I am gonna take maybe a swing. I don't know where the consensus is really at with him, but this is another guy that I'm really high on. Noa Essengue. Plays in the German BBL for Ratio Farm, same team Killian Hayes played for. But he's a 6'10" wing with a 9'3" standing reach. So that's, his standing reach is up there with a lot of centers already in the league. He's a guy that is really versatile defensively, and can at 6'10" guard at the point of attack, do all of those things. Also provide some help side rim protection, kind of really similar to the cell that Asa has, but I'm really bought into him because he is one of the youngest prospects in this class. He's around the same age as Cooper Flagg. His development over the past couple of years has been dramatic in terms of, especially with shooting. Just a lot more fluid with his shot. The energy transfer looks a lot better. He's more comfortable getting into that footwork, shooting off the dribble, or just even off the catch. But it's, the percentages might not really show that, but there's a lot of growth there. There's great touch indicators for a guy that big. And he's very high field, very, very high field in terms of being able, and that really shows up on the defensive end. Block and steal rates are a good way of kind of understanding how a player affects the defense, but it's not everything. It kind of really just conveys your ground coverage, and especially with steals, you kind of understand, okay, does a player have the understanding that a rotation is coming and I'm going to cut into space and steal the ball there? So Sang is really good at that. His ground coverage is excellent, and he's really growing as a dribble pass shoot guy. He's really effective in transition. I would say that's his strongest way of affecting a game. Is he's just impossible to stop in transition, or just in general. If you give him any open space, he's just going to draw free throws. He's going to kind of, even though he's so skinny and he's still very young, he's still giving grown adults problems at the rim with his. I think he's got some absurd free throw rate at 70 free throws. But he's a guy that I have him, I think 5, and he's a guy that I think has one of the higher upsides in the class.
Yeah, your analysis of him really put him on my radar in terms of the lottery potential, the upside, where you hit on it, a big point forward big that can grab and go in transition and get to the rim, draw fouls that way. I mean, that alone is impressive, especially because of all that defensive impact that you mentioned, the ability to force turnovers, smart help side shot blocker, I think, where just good defensive instincts to contest shots. So the ability to create those 4-point swings, or and 1 5-point swings, is huge for any team. So that's his bread and butter to me. And then he's a strong rim roller. He can finish strong he can get up and throw down and draw fouls that way. Can show some tough shot finishing with the touch indicators as well. You mentioned where he's at least flashed that 3-point shot in the pick and pops, where he's only at 25%, on 80 catch and shoots so far this year, but 70% on free throws at 194 free throws so far. So that's a promising indicator, especially for a big, of some shooting touch development possibilities there. So, just can see some of the upside because he is efficient in a few different areas. Synergy has him at 0.9 PPP on post ups, including passes, which is in the 50th percentile, showing some of that creation feel out of the post. 0.84 points per possession on spot ups, 35th percentile. 1.4 PPP on transition, 91st percentile, as we mentioned. Good efficiency on on cuts or putbacks, I should say, and about 1.03 points per possession as the pick and roll man in the 46th percentile. So definitely a lot to like there in his defensive versatility, his downhill game, and just that play finishing combination of like he could be a play finisher in the half court and maybe more of a creator in the transition aspect as well, and maybe even out of the post. So there's just a lot of tools that he has flashed that make him very intriguing, especially for the age and size reasons that you mentioned. So I can understand, how you end up sold on that potential. So with the 6th pick in the wings only 2025 NBA draft, I'm going with Miles Bird. A really exciting player that flashes a lot of tools. Like I love his defensive playmaking and kind of his fluidity to his game. He brings the dribble, pass, and shoot stuff we're looking for, but he has that pull up 3-point shot too. He has good feel to create for others as well. And I don't want to throw too many comps out there, but it's like watching a big guard in a way, almost. I don't want to say he's LaMelo or something, but like that's one guy that comes to mind in the way he plays. Just a little bit of defensive versatility, the pull-up shot, high field to create. Obviously, he's not hitting some of the crazy shots that LaMelo is, but just something of an archetype that, if everything goes right, maybe it's a player that can mold right into an offense with all those things as well. So, is there anything that stands out to you about Bird's game?
Bird is really interesting. San Diego State is a really interesting context for him too. Kind of leverages a lot of his ground coverage tools that he has. He's insane stocks guy that I think he's four block, four steal rate. Those numbers are a little juiced by San Diego's system too, I think, but he's a guy, like you said, I think the offense, he is like a big guard. I mean that both positively and negatively though, with him because he's shooting like 30% from three, I think, but I'm definitely encouraged by what I saw. I think he's got a lot of versatility, shooting off the dribble. He's really he's shooting off a movement, and there's a lot of like range pull-ups too. That like I think I see what you're saying with the LaMelo comp is he's really taking some of these shots with distance. So I think he's one of these guys that might get underappreciated with his shooting because of the efficiency numbers, but he's a guy that might scale quicker to the NBA line just because he's so comfortable shooting with that distance. Negatively, I think he's more of like he's got issues with his strength. I think he's got decent burst and he's got enough of a handle to kind of attack defenses, but it's kind of the play finishing at the rim that he really struggles with. I'm not the greatest at kind of absorbing that contact and kind of finishing those attempts, but he's a sophomore that's pretty young and so he's a guy that, there's probably some low-hanging fruit with the strength development that maybe in the league could be more beneficial to him than maybe saying in college and kind of going that route. But he's a quintessential guy that, when I'm talking about a closeout creator, a guy that can kind of scale those creation skills into a dribble pass shoot wing package. That's kind of what I'm talking about with him, and he's a guy that really can leverage that shooting gravity into other aspects of his game.
And something on that thought is that a lot of guys get billed as high floor players because their game is already well rounded, and that's what happened to Franz Wagner, where people underrate the potential of the sum of its parts, of all those things coming together, of not just being a guy that can do them, but can combine all of those threats at once to create a player that's just tougher to guard, where you don't really know what to expect because they can hit you with the shot. They know how to read and react to the defense and create the best shot for the team. So I think that aspect gets a little underrated because sometimes the high floor can also lead to higher potential because so many skills are already developed, but they can also, get better at knowing when and how to use those skills instead of just being possible tools in the bag. So, it's a good shout of just kind of how all those tools can go together. So, I believe you're up next with
Oh,
the
I
seventh
it's my
pick.
pick. Yeah, I completely forgot that it was my pick, but I think I will take. Looking at it, I think I will take. So I don't know if this guy will be in the draft. He's entered the transfer portal, so it's looking like he might just test the waters and maybe goes back for another year in college. But Dalen Swain is a guy that I'm very intrigued by since his freshman year at Xavier, and even some I saw him in EYBL, and he, is kind of what you want out of your 6'8" wings of this guy that has burst, can defend multiple positions. Again, not the greatest shooting prospect, but there's so much to love about his game in terms of playmaking and just being a very smart player that, some of those shooting development margins can improve just because, he's got things he can do on the court from day one. If he were to declare this year, he's really effective at, like lock and trail defense is probably his best uh, trait, I would say, on the defensive end. He's really effective at kind of getting back into plays. So pairing him with a really strong rim protector in the league would open up a lot for him. I think that's one thing that's really missing from his Xavier context. Um, and I wrote a scouting report on him as well. He's a guy that I think, even though the shooting gravity in there and teams really do sag off of him, he's such a smart player in terms of he's always going to, okay, they're sagging off of me. I'm going to use that open space to kind of get myself downhill, collapse the defense, create a dump off pass, or, kind of drive into the paint, kind of screen for the guy at the top of the key in a sense, and then give an outlet pass, and then he's still creating opportunities with the offense, even though the defense doesn't respect his shot. I think that's gonna really translate for him, and he's so young. He's a sophomore, but he's actually younger than some of the freshmen in this class. Like he's not even gonna be 20 years old on draft night. Um, and, again, the defense, he's really great at just generating events in terms of stocks and blocks and just being able to kind of help at the rim, help in any other scenario. And just, I would say that he's a guy that kind of fits the Dyson Daniels, Denny Adia, um, another guy that kind of resembles him in how he kind of finishes. Like, he's very acrobatic. He kind of can, um, change his center of gravity to kind of create avenues at the rim. Um, so another guy that kind of made sense to me in that terms of a comp is Matas Buzelis, but Buzelis is more of a shot rim protector, and I'd say Swain is more perimeter oriented in terms of defense. But I think their kind of physical traits are kind of similar in that sense.
Yeah, that's a fun pick right there. I mean, really impressive. Kind of hitting on all these themes that we're talking about with the dribble, pass, shoot, and the defensive lockdown on the wings. So I think that's a fun pick, and definitely interested to see will he test the waters? Will he see in the NBA draft kind of where his stock is, because he, like you mentioned, he's entered the transfer portal, so he could wind up maybe on a bigger brand or maybe a slightly more bigger school, let's say, with more eyeballs on it, to really show off his game a little more with more opportunity next year, where he could really see his draft stock rise, even though next year is also a really strong class. So if it's one of those where it really depends on where he's feels like he's projected. Like, I think if you're a late second round pick, you probably could just wait and make just as much money where you're at in college, and then try again next year, especially if you think you can improve your production a little bit and stand out with a little more development and experience. So definitely, good call there. Fun player to keep an eye on. So with my next pick, I think I'm going to go with somebody I mentioned a little bit earlier, who I want to say is at least a tall guard, maybe a small wing, and that's Liam McNeely. I view him kind of as that 2-3 type of position here, maybe ultimately a 3, but just another guy that, as I said before, is one of the first people I think of as a guy that can attack closeouts. He's a money 3-point shooter. I've said on the pod before, he's a guy that in all of these marquee matchups against the best high school players in the world, he would often be the leading scorer. And part of that is being the guy that gets the open shots playing with all this talent. But part of it is being aggressive enough to make those shots and attack the rim and take advantage of that. So, he's a guy that can dribble, pass, and shoot well, keep the ball moving, but especially that shot and then the pump fake and the downhill athleticism attacking for a dunk is what kind of stands out in my mind. And, the defense is a question mark. I think his size is big enough to kind of hold his own on that end. Like they're a little bit underrated with the size. So, we'll see where he ends up. I know his stock has kind of gone down a little bit. I think, at Mount Verde, it showed off his ideal role, while at UConn, he was maybe scaled a little bit too high with the usage and creation ask that they had as basically the number one option. I think he fits better as an ancillary piece that can knock down the open three and attack closeouts, and that's where he'll thrive in an offensive role at the next level.
Yeah, McNeely is a guy that you can already see kind of the proof of concept with him, with his older tape, is he's going to be a strong connective wing that can kind of shoot off of different shot types, really strong movement shooter, I think.
Oh, yeah.
Attacks off the catch. I think the connective passing is really strong with him. So offensively, I do love what I've seen from him. He's a guy that when I did see him in person, he did kind of struggle with kind of decelerating off of drives. I think, that's more of something you're looking for with like creators, but he's a guy that, like I'm saying with the closeout creation is like, guys need to be able to do a little bit of everything nowadays that, some of that might affect how he counters defenses once he's gotten into the paint. But he's a strong enough connective passer to kind of, move things around when he's kind of struggling. But I'm more concerned with his defense. I think there is some size, there is some lateral movement, but I don't think he'll be a strong enough defender to kind of really change the dynamic of a team's defense. That's kind of why I'm lower on him. But he's a guy that when you're this young and you've already kind of shown some skills, there's bound to be some development there that maybe they can fit a different role or they can do more offensively eventually.
Yeah, and ultimately that might be a high-end six-man type of role because of the defense, where maybe in the right context he could be a starter. I mentioned Malik Monk before. I think there's some similarities there, maybe not as much mobile shooting, but in the idea that if you threw him on the Kings with Sabonis getting those same looks off the handoffs, I think there would be some good production there. But obviously some defensive concerns as well, but maybe just a similar type of role more than anything. And, maybe there is the right starting lineup, as we say, where his defense gets covered up, or they're an all offensive team anyway, and they're not playing any defense. They're just trying to outscore you. So those situations exist. I don't know if they will win the playoffs, but the Phoenix Suns are playing basketball still. So, there is a couple of those roles out there where they're just out here to just try to outscore you and get buckets. So, that's kind of the situation where maybe he would step into a Grayson Allen spot or a Luke Kennard spot on one of these offenses where he's not expected to bring too much defense, because that's just not one of his strengths at this point. But you would hope, because of the size and feel, he can kind of hold his own. And that, I think, will be a big swing factor if he will be a potential starter, or, like we mentioned off the top, maybe just a high-end six-man at the next level, which can still be a smart rotation player on a good team. So, shout out to Liam. So you're up, I believe, with the ninth pick.
Yeah, with the ninth pick, I was gonna pick Penda, but since we've already kind of talked about him earlier in the pod, I think I'll just skip over him for now and go to my next guy, Carter Bryant. He's another, uh, you know, top recruit that was kind of started off the season with a little less usage and minutes, but kind of started that those minutes started growing as they got into conference play and the production really started to showcase. And I know he's really kind of risen up on some, draft Twitter boards and even just mainstream as well. And I think the mainstream has had him kind of in that first round throughout the cycle, just because he was such a high recruit. But he's a quintessential, 6'8" wing that can kind of really has, flawless shooting mechanics. I think really like he can shoot with really any footwork. The platforms he shoots from, like his set points are kind of at. He's really effective at kind of changing that and shooting. Um, and he shoots with range. He's got a lot of versatility in his shot. So and the volume. So all those things are kind of make me believe that he's going to be pretty effective shooter in the NBA. And defensively, he's also another guy that's really versatile. Defensively, can kind of, help provide some help side rim protection at the rim, kind of guard at the point of attack, and just do a lot of different things. He's a guy that has a pretty low assist percentage at Arizona, just because of his role. He's been used more as a play finisher with them, and it's also low usage. So he hasn't really gotten to show off the passing, in my opinion. But he's a guy that can really make some high level reads as a passer, like really making like skip passes and just really like he's making a lot of layered playmaking reads. But this is more when he's at like a standstill. I think that's his biggest issue right now. Is his handle is kind of not the best right now functionally. He's not someone that's going to really shift you east-west with his handle. He's not going to shake his defender that way. He can attack in a straight line, but the dribble is kind of a little higher, so that I think that kind of limits his burst to an extent. But he's another guy that's freshman age, something that can develop because he's such a good shooter. That he's going to get that gravity and those closeouts consistently, that he's eventually going to be able to develop some of those handling in those off the catch situations.
Yeah, it's a great call here. Definitely rising on boards, and you hit on it with the shooting. I mean, what stood out immediately was his relocation skills, just his ability to constantly stay moving off the ball, whether it's a play with a set, look running around screens to get a clean look, or just staying moving in a scramble where he's going to run corner to corner, or he'll run around the perimeter until somebody finds him. Like that off ball movement really stood out to me. And then the smooth stroke shooting. I mean, a tall player that can get his shot release over contests. Like I can't tell you how many times it looks like he's just not open, but he's just going to take the shot over the hand anyway, and it's a swish. So that's when like he's got that shooting touch from deep, and just a big athlete who can develop as a smart defender, as we say. Like he seems to really kill Iowa State anytime he matches up with him. His points per possession on those games is like off the charts. But in the most recent one, I mentioned the relocation, the tough 3-point shooting, off ball movement, the spot ups, leaking out on defense a little bit, hit a clutch 3 in overtime. Against Cincinnati, he shows off the explosive athleticism, especially vertically, with a monster slam dunk. And also impressed by his patience and kind of controlled footwork, where he might run around the screen and not be quite open, but he'll just patiently take that like extra dribble, take a step to the left. He realizes the defender might be stuck under the screen if he does that, and that creates the space he needs. So definitely a good call here, and someone who I think could stay rising on boards at least into the late first round, and maybe higher if you're a fan of like the D&3 template, like that still has value today, especially if he obviously brings the relocation, but if he can kind of fine tune some of the handle and the connective passing out of that role, like there's a smart two-way player right there. And I think outside of like a handful of superstar scorers and creator offensive engine types, like you just need two-way impact with few holes in one way or another. So defense and 3-point spacing still remains pretty huge especially for role players trying to fit in. And beyond just the D&3 archetype that has kind of faded away, it's that quick processing of decision making and moving the ball and making team first smart reads that is what you want. And I think he's shown some of that as well. So a good choice there. And shout out Noah Penda. We'll include him in that spot because I probably would have taken him next as well. But we did
okay.
already hit him, so he's right up there. And so my next pick, I want to give one more shout out to Con Knipple. I'm not sure if he's quite a wing. I view him more as like a two guard, and we'll see if he can scale up a little bit. But some similarities to Liam, but maybe more of McNeely from the previous pick, but a little smaller in my eyes. But a lot of people love Knipple for the scoring and shooting potential there as an offensive player. So that's a guy that I'm not sure counts as a wing, but shout him out real quick. But I'm going to take Ado Thero out of Arkansas, I believe. He's really impressed with his defense, especially against Georgia. He was everywhere, just making this huge big block in the clutch, contesting everything. He showed the ability to attack the closeout with a nice little jump stop and push shot, and big offensive rebounds. He ended up with like 14 and 10, I believe, and drawing free throws with that strength, just hammering home finishing plays at the rim, hitting some free throws, 7 of 9 on the night. And he had a big play where he rebounds his own miss for the putback at the buzzer. So shout out to that game. And also against Michigan, I caught him where he shows the ability to get downhill, strong physical take to the rack, made some big chase down blocks, timing up the defensive instincts. He even blocked a 3-point shot with that length and athleticism. He'll drive off the ball, reverse to the rack, and showed some impressive little things with the ball in his hands, like a rip through hop step into like a double clutch finish drive at the rim, some more rebounds and traffic, impressive rebounding. And the defense, I think, is his calling card, like good screen navigation at point of attack, active hands, diving for loose balls, even you can just really contesting everything. And even made a nice pass through a tight window to a cutter there. So some good feel as well. So some good two-way feel and athleticism for Thero here. With I like how we both kind of made 2 picks at each of these slots. So we're somewhere between 10 and 12 now.
Yeah, I mean Thero's a great shout. I mean he's a guy that's really one of the better vertical athletes, I'd say, in this. I mean, at least from a wing standpoint, in this class. I mean, like 19% of his field goal attempts are dunks. I mean, he's really getting up, and like that, I think correlates with the rebounding too. He's a great shout. I also was kind of not sure if I should be picking guys like Khan. Other guy like because they are more guard centric in terms of the skills. I mean, traditional guards. But I was also thinking of guys like Kasparis, Saraf, Dylan Harper. People view them more as guards. But I kind of see them more kind of being those like wing, connective wings in the league. I mean, Dylan, I'm a little bit much higher on the creation. But these are guys that I can kind of see playing that as their floor in the league.
Yeah, especially with the way the league is, you get a lot of 3-guard lineups now. So someone might be a big guard, but he might get a good amount guarding other big guards at the 3. So like there is a little bit of positionless basketball in that sense going on. So there's no hard rules here. We make our own rules here on the Learning Basketball Pod. So you can take whoever you want.
Yeah, I'll leave them up because I do think they are more like guards. So I'll just take the last guy on my board right now, and that's JT Toppin. I think he's another really young sophomore that's really productive, but kind of plays more as a big right now. But I think because of his size, I think at the NBA level, he's going to have to kind of scale more as a forward or a wing. So there's going to need to be some handle development with him, and he's a guy that you can kind of, I can kind of point to in terms of what I'm saying with my boards is how do I really perceive how a guy's going to play in the league. Um, you know, but I think he's another guy that's really comparable to Asa or John Collins or these guys that can kind of do a lot of things defensively, protect the rim, kind of switch out onto the perimeter in space and kind of work that way. But offensively, they're going to be these really effective play finishers, and his numbers are ridiculous this year. But I think the biggest thing he's kind of shown this year is kind of how he's more comfortable shooting, and that's kind of shown up in the volume increases over the season. And he's a guy that I think could really be a surprise in the draft because everyone views him more as a big, but if he's able to kind of scale down a couple positions or even a position, he has a lot of value in terms of what he can do as like a very high level rebounder, really, really effective, jumping off of 2 feet and really finishing at the rim. And then he has like just insane short mid-range touch, which I think kind of correlates to some of the optimism that I have with the shooting development. And he's a guy that I could potentially have a little higher as I kind of get deeper into this class and we get closer to the draft, just because he's going to be context dependent because of that role scaling down, but he's just so productive and young that you kind of want to bet on him kind of being able to scale down and still be productive in those situations.
Yeah, that's a great shout, and he does a lot of I feel the play finisher stuff that we've talked about here. The athleticism is obvious. He brings that rebounding and kind of the good footwork and post up moves as well down low. So you can see, and some people have even asked, what are some of the differences between, like, why is Asa Newell projected top 10 and JT Toppin is falling, into the second round? And I think there's some differences with the 3-point shot and the height are pretty big differences there, but you can kind of see like with Toppin just a strong defender who is versatile and can bring some of that rebounding and ideally bring some of that closeout attacking kind of all around skills as well. So nice pick there. And with the last pick in this exercise, I think there's a lot of good like high floor players left here that could fill a rotation spot, especially at the 4. You got, Rasheer Fleming, you got Joshua Jefferson, Janai Broom, Darion Williams, Arthur Kaluma, the Avicic brothers, Dixon. You got potential guys like Hugo Gonzalez and Donnie Freeman, Drake Powell. I think all these guys are some top wings the rest of my board, but I'm going to go with a guy that I want to say, I actually don't know if he's in the transfer portal. I don't know if he's going to even enter the draft, but Will Riley, who is pretty high on analytics, like BPM. He has a really high BPM in his role. He started playing a lot better with an expanded role as the season has gone on. And I caught him a couple times at least where, he's kind of a potential guy at this point. We need to see a little bit more. And some of the draw is that unknown that he flashes some of these, good passing, good shooting, where some impressive offensive stuff. I caught Illinois against Michigan State where he attacked he initiated a horns play and attacks the rack right out of that initiation. And another play oh let me rephrase that. He was the screener in the horns where he popped out in horn set where he sets a screen. You have 2 screens on the side of the ball handler, and he's the one that pops for 3. The other one rolls to the rim. And after popping, he attacked the closeout with a pump fake, spin, a bump and finish, and a tough shot floater where you see a little bit of that touch in a sequence like that. Another one where he had a nice spin from the perimeter into another bump and finish contact floater. And that like body control to be able to draw contact, possibly draw a foul, and still finish is a really impressive trait for potential scores. down the line. He made a lot of nice plays in this one with a backdoor cut on an alley-oop reverse. That was a fun highlight, a deep range catch and shoot triple, had 13 points, 2 threes in the first 10 minutes of the game. Nice little another backdoor cut for a given yo alley-oop layup that he was able to convert to. So some tough shot making, flashes of the finishing at the rim, the 3-point shot, some real touch indicators, I would say, for Will Riley in that one. And I believe he, like I mentioned, he has kind of like grown as the season has gone on and impressed, but he might be coming back. He's a guy that, they're not in the tournament anymore. Maybe his stock could have risen a little bit if he had, some big exposure there, but we'll see kind of what his ultimate decision lies. I kind of expect him to come back at this point and kind of test the waters next year, but you never know.
Yeah, Riley's really interesting as a guy that they declare because he's really young. He's 6'8" shooter that has a lot of playmaking feel. I mean, going back to his EYBL tape, a lot of layered playmaking and just really understanding the flow of the offense. A lot of shooting versatility with him as well. My concerns with him are closer with the defense and how that's going to look. I do think, he's got some athletic traits. Everything isn't perfect, but he might be a guy that, will look better once he gets stronger defensively. He's really, great at offensive rebounding for a wing, I think. That's one thing that I really liked with Riley. He's lower on my board, but I do think that he's a guy that, because he's just got that intersection of feel, size, and shooting touch, that there are some outcomes where he could kind of exceed where I have him on my board right now. But he's a guy that he's almost like a pre-draft bet in a sense in the league to me because of that strength. So him and Miles Bird are kind of interesting comparison points, I think. They're kind of very similar in that sense, where they both kind of need to put on strength, but they have these kind of like big guard skills. So I think that's a great shout, and Riley looks like he's going to be declaring just because he is consistently on all of these mocks. But yeah, it should be interesting to see what happens with him.
No doubt. There's just incredible talent here. I mean, the idea that we're at 14 wings deep and like there's probably another 14 or 15 that could get drafted from, their NBA readiness, whether it's that all around scoring versatility, whether it's the defense, whether it's a little bit of both. Just, a super, super deep class with talent where a guy like Hugo Gonzalez also has a lot of potential, but he might, he could fall anywhere from like the 30th pick to all the way deep into the second round. And, he's impressed in high impact in for his age, but, some of the skills are still a little rough around the edges. So another guy where potential will be a big factor. But, I appreciate, you taking the time to come on and talk hoops today and dive into your process and, learning about, the real potential of guys like Collin Murray-Boyles and Noa Essengue and Carter Bryant, some marquee names to keep an eye on, and Noah Penda as well, Dalen Swain. I mean, all these guys, but just some guys that might be a little under the radar, maybe not quite, consensus as high as they should be. JT Toppin as well. I mean, a lot of these guys. So, it's interesting to see, where they end up, and the situations and teams that they land with, and kind of where those development paths go, because we rank all these guys in a consensus big board type of way, but every team values different things, and they might view things totally differently just based on their own evaluations and what they need, and also not just fit today, but long-term fit and role and opportunity and investment, where will the team be able to provide the tools and everything they need to for a guy to reach his maximum potential, and that affects every player here. So I think it's almost more effective to do team-centric big boards based on where you think what the team prioritizes skill-wise in general, and what they generally need and can kind of provide a window for to actually allow a guy to thrive instead of asking him to do much or get buried on the bench because he doesn't fill the role they need, but they just drafted a high potential guy for the heck of it. Like it's that guy's not going to reach his potential if he's not given all of the things we just said to succeed. So that's definitely an interesting aspect of this. But man, a lot of fun today talking all things hoops, and I appreciate you taking the time today, bro.
Oh, I appreciate you for having me on, man. It was a long time coming, but yeah, thank you for having me on.
Learning Basketball is a Swish Theory podcast hosted from Beyond the Arcade. Hey, that's me. You can find my work on Twitter, YouTube, Substack, and check out the team's writing at theswishtheory.com.